Prime Minister has just said that he's hoping that members on both sides would listen to Canadians. For 3 months, we've been asking him to do just that. Does that mean that he now accepts to hold hearings on his Unfair Elections Act across Canada, like we've been asking for?
The Honourable Minister of State for Democratic Reform.
Speaker, Canadians have been telling us that they think it's reasonable to present identification when you cast their ballot. Now, we understand that not everybody has photo ID. That's why there are 39 different forms of acceptable ID, and if Canadians provide those identifications, then they will be able to cast their ballot in the next election. This is reasonable. It is a vast and comprehensive list that should provide every Canadian with the ability to identify themselves when they cast their ballot. This is reasonable, and Canadians support it.
Reasonable. And the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Actually, Mr. Speaker, it was the Prime Minister who just made that statement in answer to the member from Papineau. So we're addressing ourselves to the Prime Minister, who's the only one who can give the answer, because we have been asking for public hearings on this bill since day one. He just said, word for word, that he is asking members on both sides of this House to go out and listen to Canadians on this bill. Is he willing to hold parliamentary hearings on this across Canada? Yes or no?
The Honourable Minister of Democratic Reform.
Mr. Speaker, members of this caucus listen to their constituents every single day. And if the Leader of the NDP were doing the same, he would understand that the average Canadian believes it's completely reasonable to bring some form of identification to show who they are when they cast their ballot. Mr. Speaker, you have to present ID to cross the border, to buy alcohol, to opt to rent a car, to board an airplane, to do a whole series of basic things that Canadians do all the time. We think it's reasonable. Do they do the same when they vote?
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, that minister has said that parliamentary committee hearings to listen to Canadians are a, quote, expensive circus. So I asked the Prime Minister, it's the Prime Minister who just said word for word in this House that he wants members on both sides to go out and listen to Canadians. Why is he talking out of both sides of his mouth? On one side he says to listen to Canadians, on another side he stands this lightweight to give his answers for him.
I've asked honourable members before, and I'll do so again, not to make personal characterizations of our colleagues. I see is the Honourable Minister rising to answer? The Honourable Minister of State for Democratic Reform.
Mr. Speaker, the member talks about parliamentary committees. I think all of us look forward to the day when he will finally arrive at a parliamentary committee to explain how he took that money from taxpayers that did not belong to him. And in the meantime, we will continue to stand up for a fair and reasonable Elections Act that requires people provide ID, that gives independent investigations, that requires mass calls to be registered, and that brings in new penalties against fraud in election time. Mr. Speaker, this is fair, this is reasonable, and we stand by it.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
À l'instant, le Premier ministre vient tout juste de dire qu'on peut utiliser son certificat du statut d'Indien pour voter. Puisque c'est entièrement faux, est-ce qu'il peut nous dire qui lui a donné cette fausse information?
Speaker, there are 39 different forms of identification that Elections Canada authorizes so that people can establish their status as an eligible voter. One of them is a certificate of an Indian status card. That is the 6th on the list. There is also an attestation of residence, an attestation of residence issued by a responsible authority of a First Nations band or reserve. Those are lots of options, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Actually, Mr. Speaker, contrary to what the Prime Minister just said, the address does not appear on that card, and most of the people in question do not even possess one. Does the Prime Minister understand that even if you have a social insurance card, a credit card, a health insurance card, a birth certificate, and a passport, you still cannot vote because the address is on none of those?
The Honourable Minister of State.
The NDP's position is that people should be allowed to vote without any ID whatsoever. Mr. Speaker, that is an unreasonable position, and it is not shared by Canadians. Of the 39 pieces of valid ID that Elections Canada accept, there are 13 which do have your address on them. In addition to a standard government-issued photo ID, there's utility bills, telephone, TV, public utilities, hydro, gas, bank card statements, vehicle ownership, correspondence from a school, college, or university, statement of government benefits, an attestation from an Indian band, a government check or check stub, pension statement of benefits, residential lease, insurance policies. Mr. Speaker, I could go on. All these have their address.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the government has claimed time and again that Canadians can use a cable or phone bill to vote, but not if that bill came by email. And thanks to the Conservative Party's failure to ban pay-to-pay billing, more and more people are having to pay to get paper bills. Does the Prime Minister believe that people should have to pay in order to vote?
The Honourable Minister of State for Democratic Reform.
Mr. Speaker, the reality is that Elections Canada establishes the list of 39 acceptable forms of ID. The CEO has the legal authority under the existing Act. He will retain that authority under the Fair Elections Act to amend the list and to alter it to keep up with the times. If he believes that there is a need to update the list, then I would encourage him to do so.
Without having to accept the weapons of sound.
Well, now that we've once again heard the empty words of his minister, let's quote somebody who knows what he's talking about. Keith Archer, the Chief Electoral Officer of British Columbia, testified in committee that in British Columbia, 14,000 people used vouching to vote. If vouching weren't available in the last election, Mr. Archer said, and I quote, "I would expect most of them would have been disenfranchised." Does the Prime Minister think that Mr. Archer is just another uninformed hack? Is he going to hide behind his minister again? Or is he going to finally stand in this House and try to defend the indefensible as he's been doing for 3 months?
The Honourable Minister of State for Democratic Reform.
The fact that the leader of the NDP thinks it's indefensible to ask people to bring ID when they vote just shows how out of touch with reality he has become. There are 39 different forms of acceptable ID that Canadians can use when they cast their ballot. We think this is reasonable in a democratic society for people to bring ID when they vote, and that is all that the Fair Elections Act requests.
Well said.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Give the Prime Minister another example of someone who actually knows what he's talking about. David Brock, the Chief Electoral Officer for the Northwest Territories, testified in committee that in 27 of the 33 communities in the Northwest Territories, more than half of the residents don't have proper ID. These people have been relying on vouching to identify themselves for years with no problems. Why stop them? Why in good faith is the Prime Minister stopping honest Canadians from being able to vote?
The Honourable Minister of State for Democratic Reform.
The Prime Minister is doing no such thing. He is simply requiring through the Fair Elections Act that people present ID when they cast their ballot. Now, it's not necessary to bring government-issued photo ID, though that is an option. There are 39 different forms of ID that are accepted when people show up and vote. We think that is reasonable, and Canadians agree with us.